A washing machine can hide many things: stains, secrets, evidence. But on July 28, 2022, it hid something that would shatter a Texas community forever. You're a deputy responding to a missing child call. The parents are frantic. Our 7-year-old disappeared in the night. Front door was unlocked. He's gone. You deploy drones, K-9 units. Search teams comb every inch of Spring, Texas for over an hour. Nothing. You return to the house for one final sweep, room by room, closet by closet. You've checked everywhere a small boy could hide, except one place. You lift the lid of an ordinary washing machine expecting to find dirty clothes. Instead, you find Troy Kohler, dead at the bottom of the washtub. The very child the entire neighborhood had been desperately searching for. But here's what makes this case truly chilling. The machine hadn't run a cycle. No soap, no watermarks. Troy wasn't drowned in a laundry accident. He was placed there by someone who knew exactly where he was, while police, neighbors, and search teams scoured the streets looking for him. Someone who watched deputies launch drones and deploy dogs, knowing the boy they sought lay hidden just feet away. Someone who had called 911 themselves. If this already has you curious, hit like and stay with me, because the text messages investigators would later discover between Troy's adoptive parents revealed a level of hatred so shocking it would expose the horrifying truth about why a missing child was never really missing at all. 6 months before that horrific discovery, 4 lives were about to collide, in ways none of them could foresee. Troy Kohler was 7 years old and bursting with curiosity. He devoured books faster than his teacher could recommend them, racing to the class library every chance he got to lose himself in adventures about Sonic the Hedgehog. His motto was simple: today a reader, tomorrow a leader. But no one at school knew why he sometimes flinched when adults moved too quickly. Jermaine Thomas, 45, had opened his home to this energetic boy, believing adoption would complete his family. He worked long hours to provide stability, telling neighbors how proud he was to give Troy the loving home every child deserved. But his phone held messages that revealed a man drowning in rage over missing snack cakes. Tiffany Thomas had dreamed of motherhood for years before Troy entered their lives. She posted photos of family outings, school events, and bedtime stories on social media, crafting the image of a devoted parent. But behind closed doors, she composed text threats about ovens and punishment that would make prosecutors' blood run cold. Cheryl Reed taught first grade with the passion of someone who truly understood children. She celebrated every small victory in her classroom and refused to give up on any student who walked through her door. But her growing concern about Troy's bruises would lead to phone calls that authorities would ignore. None of them knew that within months, 3 of these lives would be destroyed, and 1 would be lost forever. The evening of July 27, 2022, began like any other summer night in the Thomas household. Troy had finished his dinner, completed his reading assignment, and settled in to watch television before bedtime. By all accounts, it was unremarkable, a quiet Wednesday that should have led to another ordinary Thursday morning. But something changed after Troy went to sleep. Court documents would later reveal the catalyst: missing food. Tiffany Thomas discovered that someone had eaten her oatmeal cream pies. Jermaine Thomas found his donut sticks had disappeared from the kitchen. These weren't expensive items, maybe $3 total from a convenience store. Yet their discovery of this petty theft would set in motion a chain of events that would end in murder. Text messages between the couple began flying. Tiffany's rage was immediate and disproportionate. She wanted Troy to confess or face being put in the stove and turn it on. Jermaine's response escalated the threats to lethal territory. "I'm going to end up killing him. You're going to come home and he's going to be hanging from the tree outside." These weren't empty words, spoken in frustration. They were documented threats of violence over stolen snacks, preserved forever in digital evidence that prosecutors would later use to demonstrate premeditation. At 11:59 p.m., according to Jermaine and Tiffany Thomas, this was the last time they saw Troy alive. They claimed he simply vanished from their home, leaving behind an unlocked front door and no other trace. But what really happened during those dark hours remains known only to his killers. When dawn broke on July 28th, The search would focus on the quiet residential area surrounding Rosegate Drive in Spring, Texas. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, and family homes where neighbors knew each other's names created the kind of community where children rode bikes safely and parents waved from front porches. It seemed impossible that a 7-year-old could simply disappear from such a close-knit neighborhood. At 6:47 a.m., Jermaine Thomas's voice cracked through emergency dispatch lines. "My 7-year-old son is missing. I came home last night before midnight and found my front door unlocked. Troy is gone." The story was simple, believable. A parent's worst nightmare, coming home to find their child had wandered off in the night. Within minutes, Harris County deputies were racing toward Rosegate Drive, unaware they were responding to an elaborate cover-up rather than a genuine missing person case. The massive search effort that followed, drones, K-9 units, and dozens of volunteers, would all be based on a lie. While the entire community mobilized to find Troy, his body lay concealed inside the very house where the search had originated. Within 20 minutes of Jermaine Thomas's frantic call, Harris County deputies arrived at the Rosegate Drive residence. The initial response was swift and comprehensive, exactly what you'd expect for a missing child case. Deputy units spread across the subdivision while aerial drones launched into the humid morning sky. Their cameras swept over rooftops, backyard pools, and dense patches of trees where a frightened 7-year-old might seek shelter. K-9 units arrived shortly after, their German shepherds immediately picking up Troy's scent from clothing provided by his parents. The dogs led searchers through the neighborhood in methodical patterns, down sidewalks, across manicured lawns, into storm drains, and along the creek bed that ran behind several homes. Every shed was opened, every vehicle checked. Neighbors emerged from their houses, joining the growing search party as word spread through the community. For over an hour, this massive effort continued. Radio chatter filled the airwaves as teams reported their findings. Negative on the playground. No sign at the retention pond. Dogs lost the scent at the street. It made no sense. Children don't simply evaporate. Yet despite the thorough coverage of every possible hiding spot within a 2-mile radius, Troy Kohler remained missing. At 7:10 a.m., deputies made the decision to conduct a second, more intensive search of the Thomas home itself. While the parents had insisted Troy wasn't inside, protocol demanded a complete interior sweep before expanding the search area further. Room by room, deputies opened every closet, checked under beds, examined crawl spaces, and investigated areas too small for most adults to consider. The garage received particular attention. Tool cabinets, storage bins, spaces behind water heaters, and air conditioning units. One deputy methodically worked through the utility room adjacent to the garage. He'd already checked obvious hiding spots. Behind the furnace, inside storage cabinets, beneath the utility sink. Only one appliance remained unchecked. He lifted the lid of the top-loading washing machine. Troy's small body lay crumpled at the bottom of the washtub, his skin pale and lifeless. The deputy immediately called for backup and attempted to assess vital signs, but it was clear the boy had been dead for hours. When Jermaine Thomas heard the commotion, he rushed into the utility room and pushed past the deputy, pulling Troy's body from the machine himself, an action that immediately raised red flags among the responding officers. The evidence told a disturbing story. The washing machine showed no signs of having run a complete cycle, no soap residue, no watermarks. Troy's clothes were damp, but his pants had been pulled down to his knees, exposing visible bruises on his upper legs. Blood stained the machine's exterior, the kitchen door frame, and a cardboard box nearby. This wasn't an accident. This was concealment. News of Troy's death spread through the Spring community like wildfire, leaving neighbors and school staff reeling from the incomprehensible loss. But nowhere was the grief more profound than in room 104 of Troy's elementary school, where Cheryl Reed sat among empty desks, staring at a classroom library that would forever remind her of the bright boy who loved to read. "I called CPS twice," Reed later told reporters, her voice breaking with emotion. "I long feared something was wrong with Troy." Reed had watched Troy rush to those very bookshelves every time he finished his assignments early, his face lighting up as he discovered new stories about his beloved Sonic the Hedgehog. She remembered the way he would eagerly share those tales with classmates, embodying the classroom motto that decorated her walls. But she also remembered the bruises, the flinching, the inconsistent explanations that never quite added up. Her persistent reports to Child Protective Services had fallen on deaf ears. Despite her professional observations and growing concerns, Troy remained in the Thomas home. The system designed to protect him had failed catastrophically. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the community. Troy had been rescued once before, removed from biological parents who had filled his tiny body with drugs before he was even born. The state had intervened, placing him in foster care before his adoption by the Thomas family in 2019. This was supposed to be his salvation story, his forever home, his happily ever after. Instead, the very people entrusted to protect him had become his killers. But investigators were about to uncover digital evidence that would reveal the true depth of hatred Troy faced in his final months. Messages so disturbing they would transform this case from a tragic accident into proof of calculated murder. 4 months after Troy's death, Harris County detectives sat in their investigation room facing an impossible puzzle. How do you report a child missing from inside your own home? The timeline made no logical sense. Jermaine Thomas claimed he arrived home before midnight on July 27th to find Troy gone and the front door unlocked. Yet comprehensive searches by multiple agencies found no trace of the boy outside the residence. No footprints in the soft earth around the house, no torn clothing caught on fences, no scent trail leading away from the property. The K-9 units had been particularly telling. Dogs trained to track missing children had followed Troy's scent through the house, but it died completely at the front door. Not down the street, not toward the creek, at the threshold of his own home. Detectives began focusing on the behavioral evidence from that morning. When Troy's body was discovered in the washing machine, Jermaine Thomas had exhibited highly unusual conduct for a grieving parent. Instead of allowing trained officers to handle the scene, he physically pushed a deputy aside and pulled his son's lifeless body from the machine himself. This wasn't the reaction of a shocked father. This was the behavior of someone attempting to control a crime scene. The medical examiner's findings only deepened the mystery. Troy had suffered multiple injuries: asphyxiation, blunt force trauma, and possible drowning. His arms and legs were still warm when discovered, but the rest of his body was cold, indicating he had been deceased for hours. The washing machine showed no evidence of running a complete cycle. The machine wasn't the murder weapon. It was a hiding place. Drop your theory in the comments. How does a missing child end up dead in his own house? Because investigators were about to uncover digital evidence that would expose the horrifying truth about Troy's final hours and reveal the calculated hatred that led to his murder. November 2022. Harris County investigators executed search warrants on Jermaine and Tiffany Thomas's cell phones, expecting to find standard family communications, dinner plans, school pickup schedules, the mundane digital footprint of everyday parenting. What they discovered instead would chill them to the bone. Buried in chat threads between the couple were months of documented malice toward Troy. Not frustration, not parental stress, pure, documented hatred for a 7-year-old child. The messages revealed a level of contempt so profound that prosecutors would later describe it as deep hatred in court filings. These weren't isolated outbursts during moments of anger. They were sustained, calculated expressions of violence spanning weeks before Troy's death. Tiffany's threats were explicit and terrifying. Over missing oatmeal cream pies, she texted about putting Troy in the stove and turn it on if he didn't confess to eating them. The casual cruelty of threatening to cook a child alive over stolen snacks defied comprehension. But Jermaine's messages were even more chilling. His response to Troy allegedly eating his donut sticks escalated to homicidal territory. "I need to get the locks. I'm going to end up killing him. You're going to come home and he's going to be hanging from the tree outside." These weren't empty threats made in passing fury. They were premeditated expressions of murderous intent, preserved forever in digital evidence. The couple had been fantasizing about killing Troy for months, documenting their hatred in their own words. Just 3 days before his death, Jermaine texted, I'm so sick of this boy. Like, I'm really tired of him and don't want him in this house no more. The revelation hit investigators like a lightning bolt. This wasn't about a missing child at all. This was about two people who had been planning to eliminate a 7-year-old from their lives and had finally acted on those documented threats. To understand how Troy ended up in the Thomas household, we must go back to his beginning. Born in 2015, Troy entered the world already fighting for his life. His biological mother had abused hydrocodone and Xanax throughout her pregnancy, filling his tiny body with opiates and benzodiazepines before he took his first breath. Troy was immediately hospitalized for failure to thrive, a medical term that barely captures the severity of his condition. The Department of Family and Protective Services intervened swiftly, removing him from parents whose addiction had already damaged their newborn son. It was a textbook case for state intervention, and the system worked exactly as designed. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a child welfare specialist with 20 years of experience, explains the adoption process. When children are removed from dangerous biological situations, we thoroughly screen potential adoptive families. Background checks, home studies, psychological evaluations. The process can take years. The goal is finding a safe, permanent placement. In 2019, Jermaine and Tiffany Thomas completed this rigorous screening process and officially adopted Troy. On paper, they represented hope, a stable, middle-class family willing to provide the loving home every child deserves. The system had seemingly triumphed, transforming Troy's tragic beginning into a success story. But as Dr. Martinez notes, post-adoption monitoring varies significantly by state and available resources. Once legal adoption is finalized, oversight often diminishes dramatically. The first cracks in Troy's forever home became visible in January 2022 when school personnel reported bruising around his 7-year-old eyes to Child Protective Services. The report also documented a black eye from 2 months prior and a burn mark on his back that Tiffany claimed occurred during a family gathering in 2020. When questioned, Troy offered explanations that troubled investigators. He claimed his cousin had hit him with a toy, but the injury pattern didn't match his story. Medical staff couldn't definitively determine whether the injuries resulted from abuse or accidents, leaving CPS in the difficult position of making judgment calls without concrete evidence. The Thomas family received informational resources about child safety. School staff and family members agreed to monitor Troy's condition and report further concerns. Despite multiple injuries and questionable explanations, CPS concluded their risk assessment was safe, and the case was officially closed. 2 months later, the pattern repeated with alarming escalation. In March 2022, Troy's school nurse filed another report detailing fresh bruising on his face. But this time, the injuries were more concerning. A fingernail imprint on his neck and scratches on his cheek suggested intentional harm rather than accidental injury. Troy's explanations became increasingly inconsistent. He attributed his injuries to falls on concrete, carpet, or grass, sometimes claiming his cousin had pushed him. Both adoptive parents echoed these explanations, presenting a united front to investigators. Most disturbing was Troy's claim that Jermaine had attempted to break his school-issued Chromebook, a detail that suggested escalating aggression within the household. Following this second intervention, CPS provided additional services to the family, but again deemed the situation manageable. Their risk assessment was upgraded to moderate, and in May 2022, just 2 months before Troy's death, the case was closed once more. The timeline of missed opportunities is staggering. January report, case closed as safe. March report, case closed as moderate risk. July death. The text messages investigators discovered painted a horrifying picture of Troy's daily existence. These weren't isolated outbursts during stressful moments. They documented sustained, escalating hatred over the most trivial infractions. The pattern was consistent and chilling. Minor childhood behaviors, eating snacks, watching television, normal 7-year-old activities, triggered disproportionate rage from his adoptive parents. Tiffany's messages revealed a woman consumed by resentment toward the child she'd legally committed to protect. Over missing oatmeal cream pies, she threatened to put Troy in the stove and turn it on until he confessed. The casual nature of threatening to cook a child alive speaks to how normalized violence had become in their household. Jermaine's responses consistently escalated the threats. When Troy allegedly ate his donut sticks, Jermaine's text was explicit. "I'm going to end up killing him. You're going to come home and he's going to be hanging from the tree outside." These weren't metaphorical expressions of frustration. They were detailed fantasies of murdering a child, complete with specific methods: hanging, burning, killing. On July 25, 2022, just 3 days before Troy's death, the hatred reached its final expression. Jermaine texted, "I'm so sick of this boy. Like, I'm really tired of him, and don't want him in this house no more." The digital evidence revealed 2 people who had grown to despise the very child they'd once sought to adopt, documenting their murderous intentions in their own words. The evening of July 27, 2022, would be Troy Kohler's last on Earth. Court documents and autopsy findings allow us to reconstruct the horrific final hours of a 7-year-old boy whose only crime was eating snacks that didn't belong to him. Sometime after Troy went to bed that Wednesday night, the violence began. The autopsy would later reveal the brutal reality. Troy suffered asphyxiation, blunt force trauma, and possible drowning. These weren't accidents. They were the documented threats in Jermaine and Tiffany Thomas's text messages finally carried out. According to court filings, Jermaine Thomas intentionally and knowingly caused Troy's death by submerging the child's nose and mouth underwater. The method was deliberate, forcing a 7-year-old's face beneath the surface while he struggled for air. But the drowning wasn't enough to satisfy their rage. Jermaine also struck Troy with an unknown object, inflicting blunt force trauma that left visible injuries across the boy's small body. The autopsy revealed blood around Troy's nose and a large bump on his forehead over the right eye. Welt marks covered his back, evidence of sustained, brutal beating. Tiffany Thomas wasn't merely a bystander to this violence. Court documents state she intentionally and knowingly caused bodily injury by hitting Troy against an unknown object. Both parents participated in the assault that ended their adopted son's life. When Troy finally stopped breathing, his killers faced a new problem: how to hide their crime. The washing machine in their utility room provided the solution. They placed Troy's lifeless body inside the wash tub, his small frame crumpled at the bottom like discarded laundry. But they were careful not to run the machine. No water, no soap, no wash cycle that might damage the evidence they were trying to conceal. This wasn't an attempt to destroy the body. It was simply a hiding place until they could execute their cover-up plan. At 6:47 a.m. on July 28th, Jermaine Thomas called 911 with a performance worthy of an award. His voice cracked with apparent desperation as he reported his son missing. "I came home last night before midnight and found my front door unlocked. Troy is gone." The lie was elaborate and seemingly believable. A child wandering off in the night, an unlocked door suggesting he'd left the house, parents discovering their worst nightmare and immediately calling for help. For over an hour, this deception worked perfectly. Deputies, drones, and K-9 units searched the neighborhood while Troy's body lay concealed just feet from where the investigation began. Neighbors joined the search. The community mobilized. Everyone looked for a boy who had never left his house. When deputies finally discovered Troy's body in the washing machine, Jermaine's reaction revealed his guilt. Instead of collapsing in grief like a normal parent, he pushed the deputy aside and pulled Troy from the machine himself. An attempt to control the scene and possibly remove evidence. The arms and legs were still warm, but the rest of Troy's body was cold. He had been dead for hours, while his killers orchestrated their elaborate missing person charade. If you're still watching, you're one of us. Smash that like and share this case. Because the final chapter of Troy's story would expose just how far the justice system would go to hold his killers accountable for their documented hatred and premeditated murder. On July 30th, 2025, nearly 3 years to the day after Troy's body was discovered, Jermaine Thomas stood before a Harris County judge to face the consequences of his documented hatred. He accepted a guilty plea and received 50 years in prison for murdering the 7-year-old boy he had once promised to protect. The most powerful moment in that courtroom came from Cheryl Reed, Troy's first-grade teacher, who delivered a victim impact statement that transformed the proceedings from cold legal procedure into a celebration of a life cut tragically short. Reed spoke of Troy's infectious enthusiasm for learning, his mad dash to the classroom library whenever he finished assignments early, and his joy in sharing stories with classmates. She wore a Sonic the Hedgehog shirt to honor the character Troy loved most, and had even gotten a tattoo of the blue hedgehog on her wrist as a permanent reminder of her student. Today a reader, tomorrow a leader, Reed told the court, reciting Troy's favorite classroom motto. Now, we will never know what he could have become. His future, his dreams, his life were stolen by someone who was supposed to love, protect, and nurture him. She looked directly at Jermaine Thomas as she spoke, noting later that he showed no tears, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the vibrant life he had destroyed. Tiffany Thomas awaits her own reckoning. Her sentencing is scheduled for September 10, 2025, though her attorneys are reportedly seeking community supervision rather than prison time. A request that seems obscene given her documented threats to cook Troy alive. Reed's commitment to Troy extends beyond the courtroom. She plans to establish a foundation in his name, dedicated to advocating for children facing abuse and neglect. Her goal is ensuring that future warning signs don't go unheeded as Troy's did. One devastating question remains unanswered. Why didn't Child Protective Services remove Troy from the Thomas home despite multiple reports from school personnel? CPS has never publicly explained their repeated decisions to close his cases as safe and moderate risk. Troy's story ends not with the Sonic the Hedgehog adventures he loved reading, but with the childhood joy that was stolen from him by the very people who should have nurtured it. Subscribe to TCI Crime Stories for the next case, and tell us what you'd investigate next.